Alrighty, folks, it is still May of 2024, and we're on track to have one major memo get dropped on the DIB out of nowhere every quarter for the year. In Q1, it was the FedRAMP equivalency memo, and this quarter, it looks like the class deviation memo, the mythical and long rumored class deviation for DFARS 7012. But first things first, this is officially episode number 51. We're going to have the air horns in the background. Awkwardly, we're celebrating episode 51 because we lost track of the count and didn't realize that last week was episode 50. So
It happens.
So this is episode 51. Thanks for 50 episodes. And boy, do we have a good one to kick off the next series of 50 podcasts today. So the good news is that instead of needing to worry about NIST SP 800-171 revision 3 requirements in like 2 to 3 weeks, defense contractors won't need to worry about those requirements for like 2 to 3 years. On May 2nd of 2024, the DoD issued what's known as a class deviation requiring contract officers to use updated guidance in lieu of the clause DFARS 252-204-7012. And like all decisions in this space, there are some distinct trade-offs as a result of that development and decision. And there's nobody who we would rather have explain to us what the heck is going on and what all of that means than friend of the show, award-winning CS2 presenter, contract officer extraordinaire, president of Ayers and Associates, the great and powerful Lauren Ayers. Yay! Yay! Lauren's back. So, Lauren, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me back.
I remember when we first met, I told you that your expertise as a contract officer was the exact kind of thing that people in the DIB are desperate for. And this is the perfect example of what I meant, because this has major impacts and generally nobody really knows what any of this stuff means. So thanks for fitting us into your schedule to talk about this class deviation.
Absolutely. Happy to. Yeah, it's certainly late breaking news. So I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. So just really quickly, let's fill everybody in on the background of the crisis that was brewing and is now diverted and delayed for the most part, just to get everybody on the same page. So longtime listeners will know that over the last year, a for real 100% crisis was brewing for defense contractors. DFARS Clause 252-204-7012 specifically says that contractors, quote, shall be subject to the security requirements in NIST SP 800-171 in effect at the time the solicitation is issued or as authorized by the contract officer. And as Lauren has told us in the past on many episodes and on stage at multiple CS2s, or as authorized by the contract officer is not a thing, which means it is the version that's in effect when you get your solicitation. And that is very unassuming language that nobody really paid attention to. And everything was totally fine until one day, NIST woke up and decided they were going to revise NIST SP 800-171 to revision 3. And that's a big problem because as soon as the third revision, the new revision of 171 would be final, all solicitations from that point would require the new baseline automatically because of the language in DFARS 7012. And when 171 Rev 3 represents around a 30% increase above 171 Rev 2, and contractors would need to comply immediately, that's a significant problem because you'd immediately be out of compliance with DFARS 7012. The obvious solution, as we talked about previously, was something known as a class deviation, which is essentially a waiver on contractual requirements for some period of time, which would allow contractors a timeline to implement the new NIST control baseline. However, this is the part that's very frustrating for me. Lauren, you and I, in September of 2023, got to go to one of these mysterious meetings that happen in DC, right? These happen all the time. We were at a meeting that had all of the major prime contractors, all of the defense industry groups, and all of the people from the Pentagon offices related to DIBS cybersecurity, CUI, the whole band was in one place at this meeting. And I specifically asked the question. You were sitting right next to me. I specifically asked the question to Stacy and everybody else at the DoD, what is the plan for a class deviation for 7012 when 800-171 Rev 3 comes out? And this is a true story. They didn't have an answer. They said, we are not planning on issuing a class deviation. And I almost fell out of my chair because they clearly had not anticipated this problem. This was only 6 or 7 months ago, right? And class deviations are not exactly a quick thing to turn around. Their answer was like, well, put it on your POAM, which was not a good answer because they clearly didn't know how much stuff would be on it. That's not an answer, right? The answer is there needs to be a class deviation. So I like to imagine that in some small way, that meeting and all the noise we've been making about this issue kind of got their attention and helped move this along. But, I'm not going to take full credit for it by any means. Well, it's mostly thanks to you, Lauren. So, okay, so we asked this question. They didn't have an answer, which is why we started bringing it up so much, because that's clearly a major problem. If there's no class deviation, they're going to pull the rug out from under you immediately. And then to make matters worse, a couple months later, when the CMMC proposed rule came out, it specifically references 800-171 revision 2, not this most current version language in DFARS 7012. So not only would contractors have needed to implement 171 Rev 3 immediately when it's published, but they would then need to juggle 2 different baselines over time after the class deviation, if there was one, would have expired. To comply with DFARS 7012, you have to implement 171 Rev 3 to then achieve CMMC certification. You would have to maintain the older baseline that had been replaced, even though the controls are sometimes different and they're not always the same. Huge mess. And like I said, even if they had issued a class deviation for 6, 12, or 18 months to allow you to implement it, eventually that class deviation would expire and we still would have had the same double baseline problem with CMMC assessing one thing, DFARS 7012 requiring another thing. So on May 2nd, they issued this class deviation and there's no time limit. It's specified indefinitely until rescinded, which is completely wild. So that's the situation. That's what's going on. Lauren, please, what is a class deviation? What does this mean? What do we need to know?
No, absolutely. It's a great question. And actually, you and I did a podcast on this. Obviously, you and I and Jason, I think back in June of last year. So if we want to go to the slides, you know me, I love my slides. I love my FAR, my DFARS. So real quickly, I'm just going to refresh what we talked about last June. So the class deviation is defined in the FAR subpart 1.4. And I apologize, I did not pull new slides of these, given the quick turn on this. So the effective date up there, June 2023. Please ignore that.
We'll link to the part of the episode about effective dates. Everybody relax. That's not what that means.
Calm down. These are just the slides I already had prepared from last year. So, the deviation is literally just the ability for the decision-making authority to deviate from the FAR or a contract clause or provision. So very quickly, that's what top line what deviation is. There are 2 different types of deviations. There's an individual deviation, which is done on a specific contract for a specific action that is very much tailored to that particular situation. What we're talking about is a class deviation, and class literally means it applies to more than one contract action, and it can be on a permanent basis. When an agency knows that it will require class deviation on a permanent basis, they would do a FAR revision. In this instance, it is a deviation. So this is not a permanent thing. It is indefinite, but as Jacob mentioned, could be a year, could be 2 years. Who knows how long before it will be rescinded. Specifically for DoD, you can see in the rest of this clause, each part of the FAR Council has a different way of doing it. For DoD, we implement it through the DFARS supplement. And this is the DFARS. So if you go back to the different podcasts we've done on the FAR versus the DFAR, this identifies that any DoD class deviations will be issued by this is again aged language, but DPC is the current authority or the current name for this office. So that is the class deviation you saw that was issued on May 2nd, came out of DPC. And it had to come out. Sorry, go ahead, Jacob.
That part about DPC owning it was the part that was so concerning for me, because the CMMC program office is not defense pricing and contracting.
Correct.
So, you had this issue with CMMC specifying a revision, but the people who would issue a class deviation for DFARS 7012 are a different office in the Pentagon. And as you've explained in the past, different offices in the Pentagon don't always coordinate well with each other. So when they didn't have an answer, I was like, you guys haven't talked about this yet? You haven't had a day and, talked about it over lunch or something in the
No, I
break
mean,
room?
it's an excellent point because it's two different arms, right? So the executing side of the house is what I did. I was, contracting officer, and then there's the policy side. DPC is the policy side. So they're the ones that are taking, whether it's NDAA language, executive orders, something like coming from the FAR Council, and they're the ones that are writing the policy that then gets pushed down to all of the agencies. That's actually a great setup for this slide that really talks about, it's still aged language DPAP, which is what we're calling DPC now. So DPC is the approval authority for any class deviation that does not do these two things in red. There's four, but the two that are kind of relevant here is a significant effect beyond the initial operating procedures of the department of the agency, meaning it's not just an Air Force specific thing. It's not just a Navy specific thing. It really does impact the broad DIB and all of the services, or if it has a significant cost or administrative impact on the contractors or offerers. I think we would all agree that this would have a significant impact. So there's no, even if the Army wanted to do something different than the other services, because of this part of the DFARS, class deviation had to come out of DPC. It couldn't have been done on an individual basis, which is, one of the previous slides. And it couldn't have been done simply by the service secretary. It had to be done by DPC. So I was very glad to see this, I think, between all the noise we've been making, as well as the written comments that came out of, the Federal Register. I think a lot of people had the same recommendation if we need a class deviation.
Yeah. Now, I guess that leads to a question. So because DPC is setting the class deviation for everybody, and that means that without the class deviation, one service couldn't have deviated, essentially. Does that work in reverse? So, for instance, the deviation says 171 Rev 2 is the standard. The Navy or the Army can't come back and say, actually, Rev 3 is the standard. Like this supersedes how fast other components would want to go.
Correct. And I would imagine that this language or something like it, this DoD CIO, so if the Army or the Navy wanted to do something different, they would have to submit that request through the contracting officer. And the contracting officer is probably going to have to go to DoD CIO. I haven't pulled all the threads on this yet. But this is the example from the 2015 class deviation that gave people 9 months to get up to speed on 800-171. And this is that other piece of the language that you cited. It's or as otherwise directed by the contracting officer. If for some reason an Army program office wanted to do something different than the class deviation that DPC just issued, they would need to essentially make that case to the contracting officer. I imagine it will go up all the way to the DoD CIO. And I don't imagine that there's a very compelling reason for the Army to do something different than this, given the impact and the breadth of the, essentially how many people this is going to affect, as we've talked about a couple of
times. Well, it wouldn't get approved anyway because it would go against the national cybersecurity strategy, right? Because the strategy is to create holistic cybersecurity standards across the board. So,
yeah, sure.
Right.
It shouldn't get approved, right?
Yeah, I can't imagine that anyone's going to deviate from the deviation, if you will, because this one's going to supersede it. It seems like it's going to be pretty much in lockstep. Okay, so as far as just to get back to the heart of the question that everybody has, as far as this class deviation is concerned, as far as the guidance is concerned, everything that's going on, contractors need to worry about SP 800-171 revision 2, not SP 800-171 revision 3. Your current contractual obligation imposes the requirement to implement SP 800-171 revision 2. This class deviation does exactly the same thing. All of the text of the class deviation is exactly the same as DFARS 7012, with the one exception that it says use Rev 2 indefinitely, so we don't have to worry about this confusion with Rev 3. CMMC is going to assess SP 800-171 revision 2, and sometime in the future, we will worry about the changeover to SP 800-171 revision 3. So just as a reminder, we are only worried about SP 800-171 revision 2. The crisis has been averted. However, that being said, this does bring into the next logical question: what is the timeline here? Because we were expecting a class deviation. I think, most people paying attention were expecting that there would be a class deviation. I'm pretty surprised that they did it before the crisis occurred. I figured that they would, sort of publish one immediately after this became a problem. But I was expecting a class deviation that was time limited in some way, that you had 6, 12, 18 months to implement the Delta. This is a class deviation that says until rescinded. It's an indefinite waiver of implementation of the new standard. So what's your take on that, Lauren?
Well, so I think, and what you probably see on the screen right now, this was the to your point, this was the deviation that Claire Grady did that gave the 9 months to get 800-171 underway. And that was just, baseline 171, and that did have a timeline. This one being indefinite, I think, speaks to the challenges that you articulated on the podcast. And what I imagine a lot of people put into their written comments against the Federal Register is there's a whole ecosystem that has to get ready for Rev 3, right? At that meeting you've referred to, Jacob, we talked about the DIPCAC assessors have to, update their training, their evaluation criteria. There's a lot of things that have to go into the DoD getting ready to actually implement Rev 3. So I think this is a recognition that there's more behind it than maybe they had previously anticipated. And so, the indefinite nature is, I think they just don't know how long it's going to take to get things underway. And the example that I would refer to, other than, what your folks are probably very familiar with, is at the start of the pandemic, DPC issued a class deviation for payments terms. And so by payments terms, that's for those in the DoD, you don't get paid 100% of your invoice. You get paid some portion of the invoice based on the particular terms of your contract. At the beginning of the pandemic, there was a push from the administration to put as much cash into the economy as possible, make sure people could pay their wages, could pay their employees, and keep them on the books. So that was also an indefinite class deviation to say it essentially at the top level changed all of the payments terms for all existing contracts immediately. And so we didn't do individual contract modifications to put that new terminology into contracts. We just used that DPC memo, and everybody read that into the terms. So this is another example of they don't really know how long it's going to last, right? We didn't know how long the pandemic was going to last, didn't know how long we were going to need that economic infusion. And so DPC not having that kind of timeline just said it's indefinite until rescinded. That's what we're seeing here. And I think, part of them pushing it out quickly. So, and I checked this morning, this slide is the old one from June, but DFARS still says this. So this is the 7008. This is the provision clause. This is what tells contracting officers like myself what terms to actually put into the RFP that become part of the contract. And 252, 204, 7008 still has this language that says NIST 800-171 that's in effect at the time of the solicitation. So I don't know if they're going to send out something else that changes this, because right now, as you'd mentioned, now there's a conflict, right? So 7012 says provision 2, but this provision that goes into RFPs still says at the time of the solicitation. So just like the payments terms, I imagine that if I was a contracting officer in my policy office sent out a policy blast on this, I would use the DPC memo as top cover to say, yeah, 7008 says that, but I'm going to go with the DPC class deviation because they are the ultimate authority for things like this.
Yeah.
So there's still some, I would say not fixes, but there's still some cleanup that maybe needs to happen, especially if it is indefinite. Hard to say how long there might be this potential conflict between the two.
But indefinite, like you said, indefinite, and people on LinkedIn have been saying this, indefinite doesn't mean permanent, right? Indefinite, class deviations, until rescinded, it will be rescinded in the future. So from my perspective on the timeline, we're pretty confident that DoD is going to achieve their goal of publishing the 32 CFR CMMC rule by the end of 2024, which means that the DoD is going to require assessments against SP 800-171 Rev 2. Immediately after that rule is final, DoD is going to begin another round of rulemaking to update the CMMC program to point to 171 Rev 3. I think that's probably going to take somewhere around 1 to 2 years. That rulemaking process for the update should take less time than the rulemaking process to establish the program, but you're still tacking on a year, maybe 2, from the end of 2024. So realistically, we're talking probably 2026 until CMMC is updated to point to SP 800-171 Revision 3. That being said, you still at that point, thinking ahead, can't have this rug pull problem where, okay, the new rules out, so now you're going to be assessed against this thing. There's going to have to be some sort of ramp up time for implementation, which means there's probably another class deviation at that point that says CMMC will assess you. You have 6 months to get ready. CMMC will assess you. You have 9 months to get ready. Implement this delta. In addition to that, DFARS 7012 is going through its own rulemaking currently. We expect that the proposed rule for DFARS 7012 3.0, if you will, would be published by the end of 2024. Will the text of the revised 7012 clause point to a specific revision? Will they keep the most current version and we'll just have to keep daisy chaining class deviations into the future to figure out what's going on? Again, you have the CMMC office doing CMMC rulemaking, and you've got the DPC office and the Office of the Undersecretary for Acquisition and Sustainment doing the 7012 rulemaking. So they're inherently interdependent on each other, but they're not being done simultaneously. And so to bridge the gap, we need these class deviations and ramp up time. Realistically, like I said, I think contractors will start to be on the hook for 171 Rev 3 probably around 2026. I would be surprised if it would go any faster than that. So, I don't know. Does that make sense to you, Lauren, Jason?
So for me, I think that the rulemaking part is the biggest part that we have to worry about. And I think that that's the main reason why there's an indefinite timeline on this, is because we had a rule and we thought we were going to get a rule at a certain time. Here we are 2 years later, still waiting on the rule, right? So that's the one thing that's to go through it. The other thing is, like Lauren mentioned, is that the entire ecosystem has to get spun up. But the thing that we're overlooking in that is that when that ecosystem gets the Delta trainings and all the necessary things reflected, all the information that's within the 32 CFR rule that reflects the carrying out of the mission of the CAICO and all of the positions within there also has to be updated, right? And then you have to update all the assessment guides, all the scoping guides, all of the standard guides and all that. And we forget that this isn't a 37-person team that's doing this. What is it like? The term is we got 6 volunteers that are.
It's like 3 to 7 people, depending on how many
it's
contractors.
Like it's Custer and his last men trying to hold the hill. And so I think that the timeline that you have there, I do think that 2026 is kind of realistic, but I don't see Rev 3 being required until long after that. And the reason why is because we just have the Rev 3 revision for 800-171. We know that 172 is coming after that. 172 is a part of CMMC level 3. I would imagine instead of having to go through rulemaking twice for 171, then once you make all the changes for 172, we're going to hit it all in one stone so that we don't have to go through this whole rigmarole more than one time.
Yeah. Now it's a story for another day, but it is. I still talk about a hill that you would die on. This is a hill that I would die on. If you train to the 853A criteria for the 853 moderate baseline, you future-proof your training against any revision that derives from the 853 moderate baseline. And we don't have to do this we need a year to develop the training and get everybody up to speed because we've done the training that subsumes any 171 revision. I'll save that rant for a different episode. Ask me about it on LinkedIn if you'd like to hear me yell about it between now and then. Okay, so getting to the end here, like I said, this is pretty straightforward. The class deviation is essentially modifying one line in the 7012 clause. Just worry about 171 Rev 2 until you hear otherwise, and you probably won't hear otherwise for a couple years. The trade-offs to that, however, there's good news and bad news. The good news is that the burden of implementing 171 Rev 3 is delayed indefinitely. That's a good thing. There's less cost, there's less burden, there's less rush, there's less confusion. You don't have to worry about the larger baseline for a long time. That's a good thing. Also, the disparity between 7012 requiring one thing and CMMC assessing and therefore requiring another thing is now avoided for the time being. We don't have this mismatch with DFARS 7012 requiring Rev 3 and CMMC coming to assess Rev 2. That's also a good thing. Less confusion, less muckety-muck going on in the DIB. So these are good things. This was the right decision to issue the class deviation. However, The trade-off is 171 Rev 2 is an inferior standard compared to 171 Rev 3. It provides less coverage against threats. It doesn't provide as much security value compared to 171 Rev 3, and thus the incremental progress towards having better security in the DIB will now take even longer to get to. So
why doesn't it, Jacob? It's right, because isn't Rev 3 essentially the shifting of the NFO controls into the regular standard, right? So under assumptions, we should be secure, right?
Well, so we've now had
I just wanted to trigger you. I just wanted to tee you up, dude.
So we've had 2 or 3 podcasts with Ron Ross that are, I think altogether clock in at like 6 to 8 hours of conversations around what's going on. And, he has said that 171 Rev 3 is an objectively better standard, and the assumptions that were used to create 171 Rev 2 were generally flawed. And this is them reversing those assumptions. But thanks to the lack of coordination in the rulemaking process and just the left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing, we're going to be stuck with the worser version of the tailored baseline for now several more years. That's unfortunate, but in the grand scheme of things, it's less impactful on the DIB. So, there's no solutions. There's only trade-offs. One of the other, problems here is that those NFO controls that you mentioned, all the assumptions that go into 171 Rev 2 can kind of be gotchas during an assessment, because there's no requirement to have policies and procedures. They assume that you have them, but when you read 171A, you can't verify the requirements if you don't have them. So they're essentially required without being specified. And there's like 61 of these not specified but required items in Appendix E of 171 Rev 2. So you got to explain these like mythical NFO controls. So there's a big mess that we're going to have to continue to deal with and manage until we move to Rev 3. So on balance, it's the right move. They necessarily had to do it. Otherwise, they would have blown up the issue with the CMMC specified revision and DFARS 7012. They had to issue the class deviation, but it doesn't come without its own baggage. That's for sure. So
I don't know about, you say weakening security. Sorry, I'm pretty adamant about this topic, Terry. But you say weakening security, Jacob, and I get it. I understand that the standard is better, right? But this is the minimum security baseline. There is nothing out there that stops an organization from implementing what is required of them in Rev 2 and then being, I don't know, proactive, knowing that this is on the horizon. Maybe this is the setup that organizations needed from the get-go when we implemented Rev 2, right? They should have been working towards Rev 2 as their next goal, right? We're improving our security. We're making, I don't know, substantial incremental changes into our security posture.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're right. There is nothing that prevents anybody.
It's a blessing and a curse at the same time. It's a curse because us as security professionals, we want the most up-to-date, most comprehensive standard to be the required minimum security baseline because we know that that's what's required, what's needed. Hopefully there's some ambition within these organizations now that have this new, I don't know, lease on life, so to say, right? That aren't stuck in this craziness, that for the next however long until we update the CMMC program, they spend their time improving their security posture from that baseline they should have had 6.5 years ago.
Yeah, I think by the time 171 Rev 3 is around, everybody will have implemented it organically on their own, of their own volition, and there won't be any issues whatsoever.
I don't think there's any sincerity in that comment at all. I feel zero sincerity in that whatsoever.
Yeah.
But that is risk, right?
One good point that came up was the fact that we are pinned to 171 Rev 2 is just sort of like a closing thought here, is another talking point to tell people that the requirements haven't changed, right? By the time 171 Rev 3 actually is required and being assessed against, 171 Rev 2 will have been the standard for a decade. CMMC is assessing 171 Rev 2, which has been the standard. DFARS 7012 has an indefinite class deviation pointing to the thing that's been the standard. The requirements have not changed whatsoever. The one chance that there was going to be a snafu and the requirements were going to switch overnight has now been avoided. And it just solidifies this CMMC talking point that they are really just coming to verify the requirements that have been in place for years and years and years, and will continue to be the requirement for years and years and years. So that's what's going on. big class deviation overall. Good news for 99% of the people out there. But yeah, it's another example of weird rulemaking, contract officer specific stuff that has a major impact on what your customers are going to be asking you for. As always, Lauren, thanks so much for sharing your expertise and your perspective on what's going on. We'll link to everything going on with Ayers and Associates, as well as your presentations from CS2 and previous podcast episodes. And we'll see what other memos are going to come out from DoD for the rest of this quarter.
Yeah, I mean, the parting thought here I would leave with your audience is indefinite does not mean permanent, right? So indefinite means at some point it will change and they will rescind it. And I think exactly what you and Jason were just talking about is so critical. The train has not stopped on the tracks. It's still coming. It just hasn't necessarily arrived at the station yet. So the preparation still needs to happen for all of those who have been sitting on the sidelines or maybe waiting for it to actually get final. But yeah, if it were going to be permanent, it would be FAR rulemaking, which you all have talked about at length. What that looks like. So
yeah, that's a whole other X factor, but we'll probably have once we get a little more news on the FAR rule, we'll see what that's going to do with specific revisions and how that'll impact everything. Alrighty, man. Well, it's been like a year. It's been like a year since NIST announced that they were going to revise 171 Rev 2, and 800 172, the overall of the CUI series. They've gone through the pre-draft comments. They went through the initial draft comments. They went through the final draft comments. We've talked about it at CS2. We talked about it for hours with Ron Ross on previous episodes. And honestly, man, I mean, DoD did the right thing. They issued a class deviation. It avoids a massive problem. They have it until rescinded, which means we don't just delay the problem for 6, 12, 18 months, right? They're able to hopefully sync all of these pieces between CMMC, 7012, and NIST revisions in the future, so that this will be much smoother in 1 to 3 years when this problem comes up again. One of the things that we didn't get a chance to jump into is some of the non-DoD rulemaking that's out there, right?
Yeah. So I think a question that we both have kind of brought up in this entire process once the deviation was issued was that the FAR CUI rule's out there, right? And so if the FAR CUI rule comes...
Allegedly it's out there.
And then didn't it say something to, in effect in the terminology within the FAR CUI rule, that it would expand the FAR 52 to a 421, the requirements that are listed within that to include the CUI series, like the protections needed for CUI, etc.
I mean, at this point, we don't know, right? We don't know. We know that the FAR CUI rule is going to create a FAR clause that all federal contracts will point to and include that says 800-171 is the baseline for protecting CUI in all federal contracts. Now, we have the same problem, but bigger in the FAR CUI rule, where will they specify a revision? And let's say they specify Rev 2, but CMMC and everybody wants to speed up to Rev 3. Well, if the FAR CUI rule supersedes that guidance and they default to the FAR rule, then it'll be even longer before Rev 3 is a problem. Or does the FAR CUI rule say most current version, and then we have to have the class deviation issue on a broader scale? We just don't know.
But would we? Because look at the timeline, right? The timeline needed. The reason that Rev 3 is not in the 32 CFR rule is because Rev 3 didn't exist when the 32 CFR rule was being written. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
We've said this on previous episodes. They are not going to write a rule based off of a guidance document that is in draft because they don't know what the final valuation of it's going to be, right? What is the final product going to be? We don't know. And we can't put this into a federal legislative rule, right?
I mean, this is the problem where DFARS 7012 got around this problem in 2016 by saying use the most current version, and when it's updated to a current version, we'll give class deviations to ramp up to the new implementation time. That's probably the right approach. If you hard code a revision into the clauses because rulemaking analysis says you need to come up with specific estimates for the sake of rulemaking, then you're going to have this constantly staggered issue where you're multiple revisions behind whatever the newest guidance is because the rulemaking process can't keep up. What the FAR rule does or doesn't do, the impact that it has on DFARS and CMMC or not is TBD. So it's something that we'll still have to monitor in terms of what's going on. But yeah, I don't know, because Do they specify a revision? Do they not? Do they throw gas on the fire? Do they get ahead of the problem? We'll just have to wait and see.
I think the biggest positive takeaway out of this whole situation is the DID, especially, and the DoD issued guidance that clearly states what is expected now and what is expected next.
Yep. Just Rev 2, just 171 Rev 2. You know it, you love it. It's been the requirement forever. It will continue to be the requirement into the foreseeable future. That's what you need to implement. That's what you've needed to implement. That's what will be assessed. Everything with Rev 3 is essentially on hold. So it's good news. It's bad news. It's probably good news for most people, but don't sleep on Rev 3. Something to still pay attention to in the future. It's just not something that you need to worry about next week, thankfully.
Yeah.
All right.
Speaking of next week.
Yeah. Speaking of next week, we'll see you then.
See you next week, guys.